Good afternoon. My name is Isabel Rohr. I'm the manager of academic programs and outreach at JDC Archives. I'm delighted to welcome all of you to today's webinar in the context of the Ruth and David Musher JDC Archives Fellowship. I'd like to start the program by saying a few words about JDC Archives. JDC Archives holds the collection of JDC since its creation about 108 years ago. As such, the JDC Archives is one of the most important repositories for the study of modern Jewish history. We are lucky that family researchers, scholars, filmmakers, journalists, and others use our collections for their research. We also offer fellowships to enable scholars to conduct research in our archives. And our speaker today, Josh Tapper, is the recipient of the Ruth and David Musher JDC Archives Fellowship for 2021. The Ruth and David Musher JDC Archives Fellowship was established with a gift from Ruth and David Musher. Ruth and David Musher are friends and supporters of JDC with deep roots in the American Jewish community and a long-time commitment to Jewish education and academic research and scholarship. I think today's program is the 6th public lecture by Ruth and David Musher Fellow, and I would like to extend our thanks to Ruth and David Musher for their generous gift. Few housekeeping words. Please note that your microphones are muted and that you can send us questions via the Q&A function. The lecture will last about 45 minutes. There will be 15 minutes for Q&A, but you can send us questions at any time during the lecture. And I would like to now call on David Musher to introduce our speaker, Josh Tapper.
Thank you, Isabel. Joshua Tapper is a PhD candidate in Jewish history at Stanford University, where he is completing a dissertation on the revival of Jewish organizational and cultural life in the final years of the Soviet Union and early post-Soviet period. His research has been supported by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, the American Jewish Historical Society, the American Jewish Archives, and the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, and the Europe Center, both at Stanford. Josh holds a BA from Dalhousie University in Halifax and master's degrees from the Columbia Graduate School of Journalism, as well as the University of Toronto's Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies. His articles have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Canada's Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, Tablet, the Jewish Daily Forward, and the Jewish Telegraphic Agency. Josh will now give his presentation entitled, "Who Should the Players Be? The JDC in the Soviet Union, 1989 to 1991.
Thank you, David, for the kind introduction. And to you and Ruth for sponsoring the Ruth and David Musher JDC Archives Fellowship. It's wonderful to be here. I also want to thank the JDC Archives and its New York staff, especially Isabel Rohr, Tamar Zephyrin, and Misha Mitzel for facilitating my research, both in person in New York and remotely over the past several months. On May 12th, 1989, the legendary Joint Distribution Committee official, Ralph Goldman, who at the time was serving as the JDC's honorary executive vice president, composed a series of 12 questions in preparation for an exploratory meeting on the revival of Jewish communal life in the Soviet Union. With characteristic meticulousness, Goldman divided the questions into 4 categories: tasks, resources, operating approaches, and players. What resources, Goldman wondered, can be developed within the Soviet Union so that the Jewish groups will become less dependent on the outside world? What efforts should and can be made to develop indigenous leadership? Is coordination of world Jewry's efforts possible? Should the organized Jewish community throughout the world develop strategies of intervention? Who, Goldman wondered, who he asked, should the players be? Guided by Goldman's vision, the Joint had been grappling with these questions or variations of them for the better part of a year. Like nearly all international Jewish organizations, the JDC at the time was pondering with equal parts enthusiasm and trepidation about how best to navigate the explosion of new and legal avenues for Soviet Jewish national expression emerging during the latter years of perestroika. In late 1988, Goldman had authored a confidential position paper calling for a, quote, global strategy on Soviet Jewish religious and cultural renewal, one that would draw together the kaleidoscopic array of foreign Jewish organizations clamoring for influence in the USSR at the time, from the World Jewish Congress to the congeries of grassroots Soviet Jewry activist groups, into something that resembled communal coordination. As Goldman explained, the JDC had always promoted what he called a, quote, global Jewish posture. And such an expression of solidarity seemed crucial now, at a moment in Soviet Jewish history characterized as much by inconstancy as unbridled opportunity. And yet, in 1988, Goldman harbored no illusions that a global strategy would be adopted by other Jewish organizations. He feared that in the hothouse atmosphere of Soviet Jewry activism, in which advocacy groups sparred publicly over how best to invest Jewish human and financial resources in the Soviet Union, achieving organizational synergy was a hopeless cause. Ideological divisions over the role of Israel and the rise of Soviet Jewish emigration in the late 1980s and early 1990s hardly worked in its favor. A fertile, if rather messy collection of Jewish programs and grassroots partnerships had begun to take root, and the JDC had a particular vision for how it would navigate the playing field. So what I'd like to do over the next 45 or so minutes is to explore this at the level of policy. What were the Joint's objectives, its guiding principles in the first months of its legal operations in the Soviet Union in late 1988 and early 1989? How did the organization understand, as Goldman put it, Soviet Jewish need? But why look at early JDC strategy in the Soviet Union in the first place? The study of Soviet Jewry in the second half of the 20th century, I think, tends to focus on two intertwined phenomena: the activism of a disproportionately small but relatively loud group of Soviet Jewish dissidents fighting for the right to emigrate, and the concomitant rise of a global advocacy campaign to, quote unquote, rescue Jews from the Soviet Union. The late 1980s is often seen as a culmination of these efforts, as emigration from the Soviet Union was becoming much more accessible to Jews. But the attention paid to the exodus narrative, we call it, is, while certainly an important lens through which to examine the late Soviet Jewish experience, can sometimes obscure a parallel narrative. And that is the myriad efforts to build Jewish communal infrastructure for hundreds of thousands of Jews who had no immediate plans to emigrate. These efforts were undertaken by a combination of local community leaders and foreign organizations like the JDC. While it's imperative, I think, to center much of the responsibility for communal revival on Soviet and then post-Soviet Jews themselves, at the same time, it's reasonable to underscore the substantive contributions of the Joint and other organizations in fortifying their work. Jewish communal revival in the Soviet Union of the late 1980s and early 1990s was a wholly transnational project. And in the ideologically and religiously eclectic tangle of outreach organizations, the JDC was among the most significant, among the most enthusiastic. So before going on, I want to apologize for a moment. The periodization advertised in this talk includes the years 1990 and 1991, but I'll address the JDC's work in those years only briefly, and I'll explain why with some numbers. The joint Soviet budget in 1989 was $620,000. In 1990, the budget jumped to $3 million, which was the joint's third highest country budget after Israel and Romania, with more than half of that total allocated to Jewish education initiatives. By 1991, at which point the Soviet budget had surpassed Romania's, the joint had a consistent presence in 12 Soviet cities, linkages with dozens more, permanent representation in the southern Ukrainian city of Odessa, and plans for full-time offices in at least 2 additional locales. So in other words, the scale of operations grew exponentially in a very short period of time. So in the interest of streamlining my remarks, I'll focus largely on the earliest years of the JDC's work in the USSR. Prior to January 1988, when a 6-person JDC delegation visited Moscow, official representatives of the joint had not stepped foot in the Soviet Union in 5 decades. Many in the audience will already be familiar with the general outline of the JDC's history in the Soviet Union. But in brief, it officially entered the country in 1920 after signing an agreement with the Soviet government that allowed it to ship material aid to pogrom victims in the violent years following the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. In 1924, the joint launched a major effort to agrarianize new Soviet Jews under the auspices of something called the American Jewish Joint Agricultural Corporation, or AgroJoint, which lasted until 1938 when the joint was expelled by the Politburo. Still, the JDC always maintained contact with Soviet Jewry. From the middle of the 1940s, the joint launched from the middle of the 1940s, the joint openly shipped aid parcels into the Soviet Union, largely to displaced persons returning to their homes after the Second World War. And this continued until 1947, when the program was forced underground amid a rise in anti-Jewish hostility in the Soviet Union and across the Eastern Bloc. For the next 4 decades, the JDC operated in the shadows of the global Soviet Jewish humanitarian aid agenda, never participating openly in the so-called Soviet Jewry movement, but continuing its package program well into the 1980s, primarily in partnership with Israel's covert Soviet Jewry department, Lishkat Kesher, or also known as Nativ. Now, the first inklings of a JDC return to the Soviet Union emerged in February 1981, 6 years after Ralph Goldman took up the post of executive vice president. And it came at a time of immense promise for the joint's activities in communist Eastern Europe. Put it bluntly, the joint was riding something of a hot streak in Eastern Europe. It had re-entered Hungary in January 1980, Czechoslovakia in February 1981, and Poland that same year, each after multi-year absences. But Czechoslovakia especially stirred excitement that the Soviet Union would soon follow suit. In a confidential memo written by Goldman for his personal files in October 1981, he described the wave of excitement for a possible rapprochement with the Soviets following the Czechoslovak deal. Before then, he wrote, "One did not even allow oneself to give verbal vent to such a hope. Interestingly enough, after Czechoslovakia, outsiders began to comment, and what about the Soviet Union?" Now, Goldman was aware, of course, that Soviet relations with the West were at a relatively low point in the early 1980s. As far as Jews were concerned, the Soviets had begun cracking down with greater enthusiasm on underground activist networks and public agitation on the part of refuseniks denied permission to emigrate. Jewish emigration, which was typically a sign for the West of the Soviets' accommodation of Jewish national concerns, had risen every year from 1975 to 1979, peaking at more than 51,000 in that year, but over the next 5 years, it would decline precipitously, dropping to 896 in 1984. Now, it had been JDC policy under Goldman to establish in-country operations through what he often called the front door, meaning direct contact with government officials, as opposed to forming relationships surreptitiously with the local Jewish community, which might be seen as the back door. This approach had paid off in Hungary, and then in Czechoslovakia and Poland. But for the Soviet Union, the approach demanded patience. It wasn't until 1986-87, already 2 years into Mikhail Gorbachev's term as General Secretary of the Soviet Union, that the opportunity to re-enter the USSR presented itself. I'd like to share a document. This is the English translation, well, the Russian original and the English translation of a letter posted to Ralph Goldman from Konstantin Kharchov, who was the chairman of the Council for Religious Affairs, which was the ministry that governed religious life in the Soviet Union. And it refers to a meeting on October 29th, 1986, involving those two men, Kharchov and Goldman, and Heinz Epler, the JDC's president at the time. This meeting took place rather informally at a breakfast function in New York, hosted by Arthur Schneer, the rabbi of Park East Synagogue in New York, who at the time led a foundation that promoted global interfaith dialogue. Now, Goldman and Kharchov were seated next to one another at the breakfast, and Goldman jumped at the chance to express his desire for the JDC to operate inside the Soviet Union. Kharchov, in turn, did not dismiss the idea and explained that the country's attitude to its religious minorities was softening. Goldman followed up, and this is what Kharchov wrote back. Now, what's interesting about this letter is that there's nothing terribly definitive about it. Kharchov sends his regards, but then sidesteps Goldman's request to continue the conversation. You can see in yellow, with reference to our future meeting, we shall return to deal with the topic that is the JDC's entry into the Soviet Union somewhat later. Nevertheless, the JDC leaders took this as a positive sign. And over the next 14 months, the JDC worked assiduously to secure an official invitation to the USSR by cultivating relations with Soviet diplomats in the United States. The archival record is rather sketchy when it comes to details about these negotiations, but we know from oral histories conducted in the late 1990s with Epler, Goldman, and Michael Schneider, who had succeeded Goldman as executive vice president at the end of 1987, that a great deal hinged on Goldman's personal connection with the Soviet ambassador to the US. When the invitation finally arrived in December 1987, it was really seen as the fruits of Goldman's labors. Now, to be sure, Kharchov had no special affinity for the JDC. He knew about the joint Soviet operations in the 1920s and 1930s from old government files, had consulted the Soviet chief rabbi, Adolf Shaevich, about the JDC's recent work in the Eastern Bloc. When Kharchov was asked in a 1997 oral history conducted by the JDC about why the invitation was ultimately issued, he put it plainly, quote, "It was a simple idea, not because I was for the joint and wanted to reopen it, but they asked, and I didn't see any obstacles for this." Now, on the Soviet end, it's worth remembering the context in which this took place. Perestroika, which was the monumental restructuring of Soviet society after 1985, was entering full bloom at the end of 1987 and 1988. And when it came to religion, opportunities for the advancement of religious institutions, regardless of faith, were becoming more available. To some extent buoyed by the Soviets' preparations for a year-long celebration of the Russian Orthodox Church's millennial anniversary in 1988, which for a nominally atheist regime was really a watershed moment. The following year, June of 1988, at the 19th Party Conference, Gorbachev would announce a major reform of Soviet nationalities policy, allowing non-territorial ethnic minorities, minorities that didn't have their own republic, like Jews, to, as Gorbachev put it, satisfy their national and cultural needs. So this is all to say that the environment in which, into which the joint was entering was an increasingly friendly one. And I'll just emphasize, increasingly, this didn't happen overnight, and the organic development of Jewish institutions moved at different speeds depending on local context. It wasn't until the second half of 1988, and in many cases well into 1989, that some Jewish cultural initiatives, either set up by party organs, initiated at the grassroots, or cultivated by foreign organizations, were granted official sanction. But in 1987, the JDC was cognizant of the Soviets' willingness to support the expansion of religious life, and so it quite shrewdly focused attention on working with synagogues, especially Moscow's Choralnaya Synagoga, the choral synagogue, which had long been regulated by the state. So the calculation here was fairly straightforward. It was motivated by a concern. It was motivated largely by a concern that developing or supporting secular or grassroots cultural groups, which at the time were still illegal or semi-legal, would require circumventing Soviet officialdom, a move that would contravene Goldman's very careful front door approach. The idea was for the JDC to distinguish itself incontrovertibly from foreign Jewish organizations that possessed a more activist orientation and were devoted to advocating or strengthening ties with unofficial Jewish communities. Goldman, he was so cautious that throughout 1988, he refused to deal with Soviet ministries other than the Council for Religious Affairs, even when Kharchov suggested they involve other ministries, like the Ministry of Culture. So this singular focus on religious life met with some internal pushback, which I'll discuss a bit later, but this is what Goldman had to say in a JDC policy statement on the eve of that first visit to the Soviet Union in January 1988. We decided that we would not present a program, but we would consider requests from the religious Jewish community which have the blessing of the authorities. We pointed out that we shall move slowly, taking small steps and keeping a low profile as we build up the relationship with Jews and the authorities in the Soviet Union. Our objective is Jewishness and Judaism, since generally social needs are provided by the state. This differentiates the Jewish population of the Soviet Union from remnant Jewish populations in Eastern Europe, such as Romania, with aged Holocaust victims and limited pensions. Now, the talking points and codes of conduct that the JDC prepared ahead of that January 1988 trip to the Soviet Union reveal a great deal not only about the agency's non-political agenda, which was common across its global operations, but also its self-consciously conservative tactics. The joint proposed funding a slate of programs, a kosher canteen in Moscow, cantorial seminary, facilities for the domestic production of matzah and religious articles, but they expressly avoided setting conditions, instead leaving it up to their Soviet partners to set the terms. Prior to the trip, the joint made explicit two major concerns. One was anticipated backlash from Jewish organizational partners in the West who Goldman worried might accuse the joint of kowtowing to Soviet authorities. The other was running afoul of their Soviet hosts. So their strategy, the JDC strategy, went as follows. And here on the slide, you can see it in a nutshell. Maintain low profile of our visit both in Soviet Union and abroad. Avoid press statements. Expect this visit to be the first step in extensive and slow process. If understanding reached regarding next steps or services, cause authorities or Jewish leadership to initiate public announcement. Prepare positions on how to deal with friend and foe. Expect UJA, Federation, lay and professional leadership, and others to accuse JDC of gullibility, hurting Jewish agenda regarding immigration, causing damage to advocacy groups. If asked prior to departure, whom we shall see, we should indicate that we will decide when we arrive. The January 1988 trip was by all accounts productive, if a tad unsettling at times, in allowing their Soviet hosts to dictate their itinerary. The joint representatives received limited face time with Moscow's religious community, and on a couple occasions found themselves in meetings with government functionaries who were Jewish, but skeptical of expanding the orbit of Jewish religious and cultural life in the capital and elsewhere. Of course, the JDC was undeterred. In a private briefing to the UJA and United Israel Appeal in late January 1988, after the trip, Epler, the JDC president who accompanied Goldman on the Soviet mission, acknowledged that, quote, "there will be no quick fixes. The process will take time. Today, the Jewish people have no other options. The JDC is the only tool we have that can deal officially in the Soviet Union." Now, this was less true by the time Goldman returned to the Soviet Union in early October 1988, but I do want to linger for a few moments on that second trip, which reveals the beginnings of a clearly defined JDC agenda and crystallizes the delicate nature of the joint's tactics as its interest in the USSR accelerated over the course of 1988. On the October trip, Goldman was joined by his wife, Helen. He spent significant time not only with Kharchov, but also Adolf Shaevich and Vladimir Plis, the cantor of Moscow's choral synagogue. He started in Moscow, where he celebrated the Jewish holidays of Shmini Atzeret and Simchat Torah, before touring synagogues in Tashkent and Samarkand in Uzbekistan, then returning west to Leningrad, which of course is now St. Petersburg, and once again Moscow. Now, details of this journey are recounted in an affectionate, a 2001 biography of Goldman by Tom Shackman called "I Seek My Brethren," which based largely on an 88-page diary of Goldman's travels. Shackman in the biography describes an October 5th meeting between Goldman, Shaevich, and Kharchov, in which Goldman elaborated at length on the JDC's plans for Soviet Jewry. Shackman, he makes brief mention of a diplomatic ploy used by Goldman to emphasize to Kharchov that a list of 7 programs that the JDC would support in the months ahead were actually ideas generated by Shaevich, the chief rabbi. Now, this, of course, reflected the JDC's intention to deflect any suspicion that they were imposing a program of Jewish cultural and religious renewal on Soviet Jewry. But what we don't learn in the biography is the considerable extent to which Goldman agonized over this point, and his profound concern that any miscommunication could torpedo the joint's agenda. Now, what you see now are the Russian original and English language translations, of a summary of that meeting composed by Kharchov's ministry. Proposals included the delivery of kosher food throughout the USSR, the establishment of farms as part of a joint venture scheme to produce kosher food and wine, a kosher Meals on Wheels style program specifically for elderly Jews, dispatching books for distribution through the choral synagogue in Moscow, the formation of a synagogue choir, cantorial tours throughout the Soviet Union, and a gift in the sum of $10,000 to the Soviet Children's Fund, which was a non-sectarian charity founded in 1987. Now, the farm idea, of course, harkened back to AgroJoint, which I mentioned a few minutes ago, which is often how the JDC was remembered by Soviet officials and also by many Soviet Jews. This was Kharchov's suggestion. and it had received vigorous support from Shaevich, yet Goldman was deeply opposed, and he explained to Kharchov that the JDC had essentially quit the agricultural business in the decades since its expulsion from the USSR. Nevertheless, he agreed to it tentatively as a favor to Kharchov. The gift to a non-Jewish charity was for the JDC seen as the cost of doing business. For Goldman, it was of supreme importance to have this government-issued summary before he departed Moscow. But on the day of his flight back to New York, he still hadn't received it. At the airport, about an hour or so before the flight, one of Kharchov's deputies, a man named Alexander Konovalov, finally arrived in the terminal with the document in hand. But after having it deciphered on the spot by his translator, Goldman worried that the summary attributed the proposals solely to the JDC, instead of encouraging the idea that had come directly from the Jewish religious community in Moscow. He asked Konovalov to change the language then and there to reflect the collaborative nature of the negotiations. So what we see here in Russian is roughly translated as proposals made by Vice President of the Joint, Ralph Goldman, in conversation with Kharchov, it's replaced here in Russian, and also less emphatically in English, proposals discussed by Vice President of the Joint, Ralph Goldman, and Chief Rabbi Adolf Solomonovich Shaevich in conversation with Kharchov. Now, whether this handwritten alteration was made official in Soviet records or even mattered to the Council for Religious Affairs is unclear, but it points to the JDC's dual objectives in these years: to make explicit to the state that renewal-based programs were originating from a recognized indigenous leadership, and at the same time, reinforce the idea that the Joint was committed to a supporting role. As one September 1989 strategy memo put it, they sought to, quote, bring about a relationship of mutuality and independence rather than dependence. At this time, the Joint held firm to the idea that expanding the availability of human and material resources in a religious context was the most effective way of not only training a religious leadership, but planting a wellspring of Jewish knowledge that would foster communal life on a broader scale. The JDC's approach in the first months of 1989 was three-pronged: to train religious leaders, distribute kosher food, and flood synagogues in Moscow, Leningrad, and elsewhere with Jewish books and ritual items. To give you a flavor of what the Joint distributed, for instance, in January 1989, they shipped to the Leningrad synagogue 100 Hebrew Bibles, 100 Lubavitch prayer books, and 25 Russian Hebrew dictionaries, among other items. To Samarkand, they sent 1 Hebrew Bible, 1 velvet kippah, and 1 gold menorah. Ahead of Passover that spring, the JDC posted 16 cases of kosher for Passover powdered milk, 25 cases of butter, and 1,000 Haggadot to the synagogue in Leningrad. And in the thank you letter, the Leningrad rabbi Chaim Levitus explained that the Haggadot were distributed during a community seder on the first night of the holiday. Quote, of course, there was a little bit of confusion, he wrote, but all in all, it was beautiful. In September, the Joint dispatched lulavs and etrogs for the holiday of Sukkot to 114 synagogues across the Soviet Union, and the list goes on. Perhaps the most romantic of these early projects was the funding of a cantorial seminary and choir based at the Moscow Choral Synagogue in May 1989. And this was part of a larger endeavor to train synagogue functionaries, including balei tefillah, people who aren't cantors but can lead prayer, and balei kriya, or Torah readers. And the Joint flew in Joseph Malavani, a cantor at New York's Fifth Avenue Synagogue, who, of course, is still active, to conduct a series of seminars for 10 potential cantors from from all over the Soviet Union, from Moscow, Leningrad, Tashkent, Dnipropetrovsk, and Odessa, both in Ukraine, and the city of Petrozavodsk, which is about 300 miles northeast of Leningrad. The choir, in fact, had a rather productive life over the next couple of years, debuting in February 1991 in the span of 8 or 9 months, touring Israel, France, England, Canada, the United States, and most notably performing at Moscow's Bolshoi Theater in a nationally televised memorial concert following the failed coup attempt in the Soviet Union that August. And so on this slide, you can see a picture of some members of the choir in the bottom right, and a poster advertising an evening of Jewish song. And here you can see mention of the joint sponsorship and a brochure in English that was issued ahead of the choir's international tour. And it's kind of small, but maybe you can see some of the participants, or sorry, some of the choir members here in the sidebar. The persistent emphasis in 1988, 1989 on a nurturing religious life and the considerable investments in synagogues in Moscow, Leningrad, and elsewhere were not universally applauded inside the JDC. Some felt that the strategic approach of working exclusively with official institutions, perhaps necessary in Eastern Europe in the early 1980s, was not only anachronistic by 1989, but foreclosed any interaction with the dynamic universe of Soviet Jewish activists and budding communal leadership taking place at the grassroots, outside of the realm of the synagogue. One JDC field worker compared it to, quote, driving a car using only the rear view mirror. And I'll just probably say, religious practice, generally speaking, was not a meaningful part of Jewish identity and engagement for much of Soviet Jewry at the time, at least as Jews in the West understood it. And the synagogue certainly wasn't a fulcrum of Jewish communal life. So to give you a sense of the frustration, here's that same field worker who I'll leave anonymous, reporting in July 1989 on his experience with 4 synagogue leaders from Moscow and Leningrad en route to Jerusalem for the World Conference of Jewish Communal Service, a trip that was paid for by the JDC. In a letter to Executive Vice President Michael Schneider, the field worker protested, "You cannot sincerely believe that these 4 men, no inspiration, no dynamism, no knowledge of Jewish life or community organization, no energy, will be the center of anything, especially when one sees the quality of charismatic leadership that exists in other circles." And here he was referring specifically to Latvia. It's hard for me to believe how much money has been spent on these men and their trip when money is so tight everywhere else in the organization, and when such large amounts of money are needed to finance the real Soviet work. Kashrut has little to do with the masses of Soviet Jews. The critique then pivots to a laundry list of alternative programming that would capitalize on the wellspring of cultural and educational activities percolating outside of the synagogue environment. These range from a roving educational theater troupe to sister city arrangements with Jewish communities in the West, to purchasing apartments in 6 Soviet cities to host visiting Jewish studies professors who would teach courses on a 3-month rotating basis. A Jewish poetry magazine, which the field worker hoped would be called Teas and Poems, would have a, quote, greater influence than any synagogue service or kosher restaurant. By the spring of 1989, Goldman, who had been so determined to work within a synagogue framework, now referred to it as a constraint. The JDC began making a concerted effort to, quote, reach beyond the synagogues, establishing ties with Jewish cultural associations in Kyiv, Tallinn, and Vilnius. Still, bolstering synagogue life and religious life more broadly would never lose its grip as a central plank of the JDC's Soviet agenda. That November would have been a sign, actually, that Goldman's vision for a global strategy on Soviet Jewry was bearing fruit. Representatives of the Jewish Agency for Israel and Mishkat Kesher met with the JDC in London, where it was agreed that the joint would commit to training moils, ritual butchers, rabbis, all part of a goal to establish an all-purpose seminary for educating religious functionaries. But the tides were very clearly shifting. At that same meeting, the joint formed its first Soviet Union team, a group of 6 field workers assigned to different republics and regions and tasked with making connections with people active in any manner of Jewish life. Now, these men had few contacts on the ground, suspect knowledge of Soviet geography, and this is recalled rather self-mockingly in interviews I've conducted with these field workers. They all tell the story of when they were gathered in London. They needed a map of the Soviet Union. They didn't have one. One member of the Soviet Union team, Stuart Sapper, whose name you see mentioned here, brought that map, laid it out. The team members then sort of, carved up the Soviet Union, so to speak, and assigned the field workers to different regions. And if you're familiar with your Soviet or post-Soviet geography, you can see that there wasn't always geographical coherence to the assignments. Seymour Epstein, for instance, is given the Baltics up here, but also these cities which are well into the Russian interior and into Siberia, some 5,000 kilometers or so away. This other image is the Moscow Jewish religious community's visa invitation request for the Soviet Union team's first visit. So as a unit, they're not all here, but most of them are, to Moscow in December 1989. But so the marching orders for the Soviet Union team speak to a growing acknowledgement within the JDC of the limitations of the synagogue first approach. Following a trip to Riga in May 1989, future Soviet Union team member Seymour Epstein wrote a letter to Goldman that nicely encapsulates the coming diversification of the joint Soviet platform. Quote, "All of our activity should be multifaceted and pluralist so that Russian Jews, like others around the world, can express their Jewishness not only through religion and spirituality, but also in the arts, culture, study, sports, etc." And over the next year, the joint would expand its work into many of these areas. By the fall of 1990, the JDC had helped open 65 Jewish libraries across the Soviet Union. Over the high holidays that year, they sent 32 Russian-speaking Israeli couples to lead festivities in 27 cities, including Bukhara in Uzbekistan, Kutaisi in Georgia, and Alma-Ata in Kazakhstan. Reaching, or so the JDC claimed, around 94,000 Jews. They provided startup costs for a welfare program in Kyiv, which was a sector, if you recall, Goldman had originally wanted to avoid, but would soon become a linchpin of the JDC's Soviet and post-Soviet work. And they dove into a staggering assortment of community building initiatives, always striving to follow the lead of their Soviet partners, which as you might imagine, could work better in theory than in practice. For instance, one field worker reported in August 1990 that the audiovisual equipment the JDC had sent to synagogues, and again, I'll leave the field worker in the city anonymous, sent to the synagogue's school 14 months earlier had not been removed from its packaging, nor had shelves been set up for a major shipment of books arriving to coincide with his visit. And so in his report, the field worker explained that all of this was followed up by an honest and frank exchange with Perelman, who worked at the synagogue, in which I made clear that the rules of engagement between JDC and the synagogue were henceforth going to be different. His reaction was quite interesting. He was extremely apologetic and tried to shift the blame to Grossman, another synagogue functionary who was not present. The issue is simply that we and our projects are not a priority for them. The message, this is the JDC's message, got across. From that moment on, he showed himself willing to assist and in general, see to it that there was a spirit of cooperation. For some Soviet Jewish leaders, that spirit of cooperation could seem an imposition, though this is a subject for another time or something we can discuss in the Q&A. The language that the Joint used in its publicity material in these years, while sincere and well-intentioned, could also come across as somewhat condescending. In a December 1990 publication of the newsletter JDC Challenge, one executive summarized what the Joint had discovered since re-entering the Soviet Union in 1988. Quote, "What we have found in our visits to the Soviet Union over the past 2 years is a vast Jewish cultural and communal wasteland." A bit hyperbolic, perhaps, but no doubt intended to underscore the JDC's really determined efforts to redress the situation as they saw it. The Joint would plow ahead into 1990 and beyond with a four-pillared approach. The spread of Jewish knowledge, which ran the gamut from setting up Jewish libraries, I mentioned, to publishing Jewish-themed children's books in Russian, to producing a Russian language version of the Israeli Sesame Street, Rehov Tzum Tzum, the development of human resources, not only religious personnel, but teachers and communal workers as well. Third, the support for national Jewish institutions like the Judaic Study Center established by Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz in 88, 89, and the Congress of Jewish Organizations and Communities of the USSR, which was founded at the end of 1989, was the first attempt to establish a confederation or umbrella coordinating body of Soviet Jewish communities. And finally, the cultivation of communal infrastructure, from property reclamation to programming to creating Western-style Jewish community centers. Goldman's emphasis on mutuality and independence would remain in the foreground. As that JDC Challenge newsletter explained, quote, "A massive revival of Jewish life is underway. Soviet Jews may have few resources and little knowledge, but they have the most precious resource of all, the quality of their people. While they will require assistance from the Jewish world, they will in the end resuscitate themselves." Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Josh, for this very interesting lecture. And I think you can, maybe you should stop sharing your screen, Josh, so that the audience members see us a little bit better. So I would like now to open the Q&A session. As a reminder, the microphone of the audience members are muted, and they can send us questions via the Q&A function. And actually, I will start. I have one question for you, Josh, about the sources you use, because you mentioned oral history interviews. And can you talk to us a little bit more about that? What exactly, who you interviewed, and whether, I mean, we have a rich collection at JDC Archives, whether that's what you use, whether you conducted your own set of interviews.
Right, so regarding the JDC, I've used oral histories from 3 main sources. What is most, I think, readily available to researchers is the oral histories that were conducted in 1997, as I mentioned in the talk, for a sort of like anniversary project of some sort for Ralph Goldman. I forget exactly why. But so there are a lot of interviews, not only with Goldman, but people like Kharchov, people like Epler, Shaevich, a number of the characters I mentioned in my talk But they're all sort of about Ralph Goldman, and they don't speak to the joint activities more broadly. And a second oral history source that I've used are the oral histories conducted by a woman named Anita Wiener, who actually wrote quite a detailed volume of the joint's activities in this over a much longer period, well into the late 1990s. Also with some of these individuals, but also a lot of the field workers, many of whom I think including all of the first Soviet Union team members. And she's very graciously shared her interviews with me, although much of her work is not based on these interviews, and they're lacking in detail in some respects. And finally, interviews I conducted on my own with many of those Soviet Union team members, but also with Soviet Jews, those some still living in the region, others who have since emigrated, who dealt with the joint, on a programmatic basis, on an administrative level. That's the third source.
Great, and I do see that we've received a number of questions. Let's see. The first question is, please, if you could please discuss the increasing rush for the exits by Soviet Jews on attempts to create Jewish communal structures.
Right. Great question. So by 1988, emigration was becoming much easier. By 88, a negative. So as I'm sure many know, it was always very difficult for Jews to emigrate from the Soviet Union. To put it quite simply, by 1988, a negative decision on an emigration application could be challenged in the courts. First-time applicants generally didn't experience any trouble trying to leave. There was the refusnik issue was becoming it was still of great concern to a number of activist organizations in the West, but on real terms, it was becoming less of a concern. Numbers dwindled, according to one organization, to fewer than 1,000 by 1991, and so. I'll give you some numbers. In '89, roughly 71,000 Jews left the Soviet Union. 1990, around 200,000. 1991, 187,000. And so there was this great exodus. And so I can answer this question in the context of the JDC. The JDC always adhered to the idea that Aliyah, not just emigration in general, but emigration to Israel specifically, was central to the global Jewish agenda when it came to Soviet Jewry. And they were always very careful not to undermine that position. JDC documents from the time, they quite openly acknowledge, if not support outright, the idea that world Jewry should achieve the maximum possible emigration of Jews from the USSR, which was, of course, Israel's position. But they were always very conscious that hundreds, thousands, and millions of Jews were going to remain. And so that had to be a central plank of their agenda. And so on the ground in the USSR, the JDC wasn't really in the business of assisting with emigration, although they were quite active in Europe, helping Jews transiting from the Soviet Union to points west in Israel. But when it came to assisting immigrants in the Soviet Union, they left that to the Israelis and to other organizations. And at different times, this becomes a point of conflict. You'll see in the archives field workers writing back to New York and describing sensitive situations with the Jewish Agency or the Shkat Kesher, sort of over turf. They had different agendas on the ground. I'll leave it there.
Well, actually, that brings it very nicely to the next question. What other international organizations were involved in community building and Jewish life in the former Soviet Union?
Right. So a lot.
Well, if you could just mention a few, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like the list goes, it runs the gamut from B'nai B'rith to the Memorial Foundation for Jewish Culture, the Anti-Defamation League. I mentioned the Jewish Agency for Israel, the Jewish Theological Seminary, ORT, Chabad Lubavitch, the World Union for Progressive Judaism, the Conservative Movement, Agudath Israel of America, and then of course there are organizations like the National Conference on Soviet Jewry, Union of Councils, Soviet Jews, these activist organizations that had been present for many decades. The JDC, when it came in 1988, 89, was sort of aware, they were aware of 13. I'll add to this list YIVO, which was doing work with communities in Lithuania, also the World Jewish Congress, which was quite influential in setting up the first quasi-Jewish community center in Moscow in early 1989. The JDC funded many of these organizations. They funded Lubavitch, they funded World Union for Progressive Judaism, they funded Masorti camps, they collaborated with the National Conference and federations and Jewish community relations councils in the US on city-to-city partnerships. St. Louis and Riga as an example, Milwaukee and Omsk, Baltimore and Odessa. And of course, they worked with the Jewish Agency for Israel and with Lishkat HaKesher, the representatives of the Israeli government.
Thank you, Josh. Okay, the next question is, do you think secular American Jews at JDC objected to reviving the Jewish religion where it had been successfully suppressed by the anti-Semitic communist regime?
Right.
And I think the person sent a follow-up, maybe. I'm sorry. I'm just trying to see. I think we might have a follow-up too. No. This is the question.
That's an interesting question and a perspective I don't necessarily have. I'll say that. I mean, this is how the joint operated in many countries, of course, especially in Eastern Europe, providing these kinds of goods and sort of seeing, at least at the outset, religion as a starting point. Like if we're talking about like these sort of early field workers, the people who were originally on the ground in the Soviet Union, some were secular, some were not. Some, I mean, Asher Ostern is a rabbi, and so Ralph Goldman was deeply in touch with Yiddishkeit. So it's not necessarily the case that they were all secular. What was important was that they all had Israeli passports, and so even though all of these field workers on the original Soviet Union, I believe all of them were Olim, it was important that they carried Israeli passports, so as not to draw attention to themselves as perhaps Americans committing subterfuge or something in the Soviet Union.
I think this is a very interesting fact. The next question is, could you please address the decision-making process of that period? Who was involved in decisions regarding how the joint carried out its activities in the Soviet Union? Right.
So I can answer this in two ways using two different source bases. when you look in the JDC archives, either like 88, 89, also into the 1990s, before the collapse of the Soviet Union at the end of 1991, Ralph Goldman is everywhere. This was very much his baby, and I perhaps wasn't so clear on this. As I mentioned at the very beginning, in 88, 89, he was the honorary executive vice president. He had been executive vice president from 1976, I believe, to 87 when he passed the baton to Michael Schneider. But Schneider knew that this was Goldman's thing, right? That he had, that he had wanted this for so long, and so this, and so I don't want to say aloud, but Goldman stayed on as an honorary executive vice president, and his his portfolio was largely the Soviet space. So in terms of crafting policy and so on, my sense is that it's mostly coming from Ralph Goldman, and even though he was quite up in age by this time, he was still making field trips to Moscow, and there were very rich and illuminating reports on the schools that he was visiting, the synagogues that he was visiting, the different programs he was attending, but from talking to a lot of these field workers, they did have quite a bit of autonomy in how they carried out their work in their, in various local contexts, and and it's important to mention that Odessa is not the same as Riga, right? And Leningrad is not the same as Kharkov, and so there are different Soviet personalities, Jewish or non-Jewish. There are different national contexts, happening on a much higher political level, and so working on the ground, I think these field workers did have a lot of autonomy to carry out programming and build relationships in a way that they saw as productive.
Josh, I will ask you, I see we have two more questions we can go through. So the first one is, can you briefly summarize the dynamics in 89-91 of the tensions between the push for Aliyah versus investment in rebuilding Jewish life? And I will ask you the next question after.
Right. So I think I addressed this a moment ago, but I can sort of speak generally about this issue. That like on a political level, like a Jewish political level, there, as I alluded to in the talk, there were these divisions between how Jewish communities should invest their dollars in the Soviet Union, whether money should be given to programs run by Israel to help with immigration, or whether investments should be made in programmings to either sort of help Jews in the Soviet Union become more Jewishly aware in the event that they decided to emigrate, or not, that they would become sort of more Jewishly aware and contribute to community development. And certainly over the 1990s, that becomes the JDC's focus, as emigration becomes less of a concern. I mean, it's still happening in great numbers through the 1990s, but less so than 1990, 1989, 90, 91. And so that's where investment dollars are spent. But it's we would have to go through sort of organization by organization. It was really, I mean, you see this all over the place, regardless of the organization you look at or the archive that you're in, that the Soviet Jewry was sort of seen as a tabula rasa, or kind of like a gold mine, and so whether or not they plan, they plan to evacuate in toto, right? Nevertheless, organizations, most of them, except for the ones that were expressly interested in emigration, committed to some kind of renewal project.
So I think this answered some of parts, if not all, of the next question, which is, can you briefly address the fall of the Soviet Union and its effect on the recently established JDC operations? I think you've covered a little bit this in that previous.
Right. Well, this is another question that demands a much longer lecture. Again, so like I said 2 answers ago, there were very strong national movements throughout the Soviet Union at the time, especially in the Baltic countries, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Some places like Ukraine and Moldova, and so even before the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Joint was thinking about how to deal with these national groups, and so you see evidence of meetings being taken with political officials, diplomats, and so on. So it's sort of like laying the groundwork. I mean, no one, of course, knew at the time that the Soviet Union was going to collapse, but there was a very real sense that there was going to be some kind of diffusion, and that the Joint would need to work, not with a ministry located in Moscow, perhaps, but in the Republican capital, there's a great document by one of the Soviet Union team members, my friend Stuart Saffer, who lives in Israel. And this is from, I believe, maybe summer 1990 or early 1991. And he's sort of laying out in this document a new JDC approach to the Soviet Union, planning for, or thinking about ways the Joint can sort of navigate nationalist agitation that was going on in the Soviet Union at the time, and kind of shifting their efforts from being sort of more centrally focused on Moscow to thinking more explicitly in regional terms. And then after, of course, after 1991, the Joint begins its operations in all of these new countries, and continues to this day, of course.
So Josh, I kind of lied to you. There's one more question. Hopefully it won't take too much of your time. Was there any kind of coordination between international organizations that were involved in community building in the former Soviet Union?
Yes. So like I said, the Joint funded a lot of these initiatives. They worked with, for instance, in the U.S., federations and JCRCs to set up community partnerships and sister city relationships. The Joint sort of ran its own programming, but also funded all of this other stuff. And so, they were very pluralist in their approach. They funded Lubavitch, and they funded Reform, and they funded the conservative movement. They also funded Soviet Jewish organizations, both on a local scale, these new Jewish cultural societies that were cropping up at the time, in some cases helped them set up. They partnered with schools, sending curricular packages and equipment to carry out teaching. They sent money to this Congress of Jewish Organizations and Communities, a 5-figure sum, which then appears to have been misspent, and support was stopped. So, again, over the long durée of the Joint's work in the Soviet Union from '88, well into the '90s, they were funding different programs at different times, And I'll add, we'll always working in partnership with the Israelis.
Well, this was really the last question. So thank you so much, Josh, for this fascinating lecture and for taking the time to answer the questions. Thank you to our audience members for attending and for sending some great questions too. I hope you've all enjoyed the program today. Our next webinar will take place on September 8th. Tuvia Freeling will give a lecture on Dr. Joseph Schwartz. The invitation will be sent in August. You will also be able to sign up for it via our JDC Archives Facebook. And if you're interested in hearing about our next upcoming webinars and programs, please sign up for our e-newsletter. And thank you, everyone, and wishing everyone a great rest of the summer.
Thank you.